Welcome to another episode of the Gay Bar Archive Show, where we explore gay history one bar at a time. I'm your host, Art Smith, and our guest today is Gary Mortimer. He was the very first bartender at the iconic Backlot Theater at Studio One in West Hollywood, and he'll be telling us about his memories of gay bars from Southern California in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So welcome to the show, Gary.
Thank you.
It is so exciting to have you here. You've got such a long and colored history with gay bars in Southern California. And so I want to start off because this is kind of a premise of the whole project that I've done.
Okay.
Back in the day, in the 60s, 70s, even into the 80s, the first gay bar experience was often very significant to a lot of people because it introduced them to a new world that they really didn't know existed.
Correct.
Your first gay bar experience was in San Diego in the mid-60s, just out of the Navy. What was that like for you?
Actually, it was pretty scary, but I learned a lot from it. I worked in La Jolla. I lived in Pacific Beach area somewhere. I forget where it was at the time. And I worked in a gas station in La Jolla. So I wanted to find some gay friends and a gay bar. And I searched around and I found this place that somehow I knew it was gay. And it was far enough away from where I worked and where I lived. And I thought, nobody's going to know that I'm there. And I have to be careful sneaking in. I didn't want anyone to see me going in. But I managed to go in. I'm sitting at the bar having a drink and I was a nervous wreck. But I just happened to look way down at the end of the bar and I saw some man that I knew and I thought, oh my God, I'm busted. And then I thought, wait a minute, why is he in here? So I had the courage finally to go down and talk to him. And we sort of laughed that we were both busted, but we were both gay. So we had a good evening there. And I don't think I went home with him, but at least that was my first experience there. And I went in quite a few times after that because I felt it's okay in this place. Nobody knows me.
Yeah, they were a really important part of our life back then. And
Absolutely.
It definitely made a difference in so many of the things that happened since then, organizing people for political causes, giving people some sort of a safe place to go and talk to other people like themselves and come to terms with being gay at a time when it wasn't even talked about. It wasn't on television. It wasn't in books or anything. It was an underground culture almost.
That's right.
So after you'd lived in San Diego for a while, you apparently found your way down to Los Angeles, which was like a gay mecca compared to a lot of other cities in the country.
Yes, it was.
And you told me that you had a career working, I believe it was as a bartender or waiter at the Windjammer.
I was a bartender at the Windjammer, but I started as a bartender when I worked in La Jolla in the gas station. I would pump gas and work on cars. And one of my customers pulled in one day. He was younger than me, and he told me he was opening a restaurant up in Anaheim, and he wanted me to be a bartender. And I said, a bartender? I don't know anything about being a bartender. But he said, I'll teach you. And he did. So I went to that location, which he wanted to call Beefeater. It was already a restaurant there, but when he moved in, he wanted to be Beefeater. So they paid a lot of money to have this big sign that said Beefeater on it. But Beefeater Gin came to them and said, you take that sign down or I'm going to sue you. So he had to take that down and decided to call it the First Cabin. I had a huge bar area there. And from my bar, you could look out and see the chef. There was an open grill that the chef worked at. And he was a black man, and he and I became very good friends. And after about a year working there, he told me he had a job up on the Sunset Strip as a chef. So he said, why don't you see if you can get a job up there too? And I said, sure, why not? So I told the young owner of First Cabin, who hired me, I said, I've decided to quit and I'm going to go up to Hollywood and work as a bartender. And he said, you're going to Hollywood, the Sunset Strip? Yeah. He said, they'll eat you alive. And I said, oh, really? So anyway, I quit And I went up to Hollywood and I got the job as a bartender in the Windjammer.
Now, the Windjammer has kind of a storied history. I've looked into it a good bit. And from, I think, the 1930s up until like 1968, it was known as Villanova.
Yes.
And Villanova has a couple of claims to fame in it. If I'm not mistaken, that was the place where Joe DiMaggio and Marilyn Monroe went on their first blind date.
That's right.
And it was also, one of the owners was Vincent Minnelli, who proposed to Judy Garland at that very restaurant.
Yes.
It was already kind of famous before you got there. And then
Yes,
around 1968, it changed names to the Windjammer, and it seemed to have disappeared from history. I know you and I have both looked for it online, and there's very limited information about the Windjammer incarnation of it. Obviously, it looked exactly the same on the outside.
Yes.
Because its later and current reincarnation as the Rainbow Bar and Grill still looks
Correct.
the same. But what was it about Windjammer? What did they do to when they changed over? Was it just a change of ownership that wanted a new name, or
Basically a change of ownership? Yes. They came up with the name Windjammer because I think part of it was because we had a bar upstairs also, and it was a smaller bar than the one downstairs I worked, and inside that bar it looked kind of like a ship. It was a small bar, and then a small area of the bar. You have to go down a few steps, and there was a little square dance floor and sort of some cubicles around. So they came up with the idea of naming it like a boat. So they called it the Windjammer. And I worked up there every now and again in the evening after the restaurant part was closed. And I recall one night I was working there, and there was a long staircase you had to go up to get to that bar. And I heard this woman's voice saying, "Pita, Pita, Pita." And it turned out it was Mia Farrow looking for Peter Sellers, who had already come up to the place. Johnny Mathis was one of our regulars. And it's interesting, as I was a kid, I was a big fan of Johnny Mathis, and I bought his records, and I played them over and over and over again. Never did I imagine back in Iowa as a kid that years later, not only would I meet him, but he would become a customer of mine in our bird business, and I would be in his house. And so that was very exciting when I first met him at the Windjammer.
now?
And as far as not knowing, finding history, I've been looking for years to find out history about the Windjammer. And I even saw a video that I think is still available, where some woman interviewed the lady owner of the Villanova just when they were about to move to the beach and open out there. And she said it went from the Villanova to Rainbow Bar and Grill. And I emailed her, and I think I spoke on the phone, and I said, "What about the Windjammer? The Windjammer was there a few years." "No, I didn't know that." Well, I've done research for years, and I finally found a picture someone took when they were driving up Sunset Strip, and you can see in the distance a long vertical sign that had the Largo on it. The Largo was next door to the Windjammer, which was a strip joint at the time. And beyond that sign, you could see faintly another neon sign that said Windjammer on it. So I said, that's the only proof I have that it was indeed the Windjammer.
Yeah, and it was in red neon, I think, right?
Yes.
And also, you sent me a copy of an ad for the Windjammer, which obviously is another bit of evidence, shows the same address.
I think it also says formerly Villanova.
It does. So we know it existed for about 4 years.
Yes.
And we also know, and obviously being in LA, a lot of these places had some celebrity clientele, and some people over time would show up in there and meet other people. But one story that you mentioned to me is a guy that his name probably eludes a lot of people, but his story does not. And you mentioned to me that you had met Henry Wilson there, who was a customer of yours at that
yes.
restaurant, the Windjammer, around 1970. Now, for those who don't know, Henry Wilson was an iconic talent agent in Los Angeles who basically molded the careers of what were the 50s and 60s kind of beefcake actors.
Yeah.
Tab Hunter, Rock Hudson, several others that he put on the map. But
That's right.
the scandal later became that he was maybe leveraging his position for sexual favors with some of those people. And there's been a movie or two made about whether or not that was true. But a lot of the actors that were in his stable were either known to be or suspected to be gay at the time.
True.
So he was kind of an unusual character in the Hollywood scene in late 60s, early 70s. But you met him at the Windjammer.
I did. He was a regular customer. He would sit just inside the restaurant from my bar. He was there almost nightly. And we used to plug in phones at the booths for each of them. And he would be on the phone constantly. And one evening, one of the waitresses laughed. She came into the bar and laughed. And she said, I watched Henry over there. And he was calling time. He wasn't calling one of his clients or something like that. But I remember distinctly, he always had a snifter of Grand Marnier. He loved Grand Marnier. Sometimes he would come in at the end of the night and sit at my bar and drink his Grand Marnier, to the point that we thought he would fall off the stool. He'd get so drunk, but yet he managed to drive home to Beverly Hills, I think, where he lived. Luckily, he made it without any accidents. But I knew Henry quite well.
Intimately, one might say.
Yes, he invited me once to follow him home and spend the night at his house, which I did.
So now you have a 1 degree of separation between Rock Hudson and Tab Hunter and
Yes.
all those people as well.
Right.
So
I saw Rock Hudson live many years later in Studio One, but that will be later. We'll talk.
Now, after the incarnation as Windjammer, that same business became known as the Rainbow Bar and Grill.
Yes.
And it is still in existence today. Is that correct?
It absolutely is. In fact, I went there a couple of years ago and still trying to find information about the Windjammer, which I was not able to do yet. And I don't know why, but I called and asked them if I could come and tour the Rainbow Bar and Grill, because I used to work there. And they were they almost didn't want me to. They said, well, we'll get back to you. And they finally did. So they allowed me to go there to take a tour, which was interesting because there were quite a few changes. And when I wanted to go upstairs to see the bar up there, most of it was totally in the dark. I couldn't even take any pictures. They were very standoffish. They didn't want me to know a lot that was going on there. And the large bar downstairs that I worked at used to be very oblong, where people could sit on both sides of it. Now it's cut off, so there's a wall on that one side of the bar. So it had changed quite a bit. I said I was trying to find proof that it used to be the Windjammer, and they just sort of ignored that.
Now, there are stories that I've read about the Rainbow that suggest that either attached to or adjacent to it was kind of a no-tell motel. Is that the case? Is there a kind of a sleazy accommodation somehow attached to it? Or
I really don't know about that. All I remember was the Largo was next door, which is now the Roxy Theater. One of the strippers, Stormy Weather, used to come over and talk with me before she did her show that night. But back then, the Largo was the only sexy place I knew of. I don't know of anything behind. The only thing I know about behind the Windjammer was when I was robbed.
Well, that's not a good thing.
No, we had all of us who worked there, we couldn't park in the parking lot that was reserved for customers. So we had to park up on the hill behind the place where there was another street. And I usually was the last one at the place, so I would lock up at night. And one night I was walking up to my car and 3 young men accosted me, and one hit me in the back of the head with the butt of a knife, and they took my wallet.
Now, after the Windjammer, when it was the Rainbow, it had another claim to fame. Its opening night there was a performance and party that focused on Elton John, who had only recently come to the United States for his very first visit a year or two earlier. So there was, that kind of put it on the map again. But was there anything monumental that happened during the 4 years or so that it was Windjammer? Were there any big celebrity events or?
No events per se. No, I just know that we had a lot of customers that were celebrities that would come in. It was just a normal thing, but I don't know of any major events at that location. No.
Now, after you moved on from the Windjammer, you found yourself at Oliver.
Yeah. The reason I left the Windjammer, they actually closed because they couldn't keep it open. They didn't have the money, and they stopped paying me and the waiters and waitresses there for 2 or 3 weeks. And we eventually had to take them to small claims to try to get paid, and we never did get paid. But that's why it closed and why I was looking for another job. And I found this location on La Cienega, which was called Oliver. And strangely enough, that's another one that's I've searched for years and I still cannot find a picture of that place, but I found matchbooks that have the name Oliver on it. And for some reason, they changed the name to After Dark, and they're using the same logo, but it's called After Dark. That was a very interesting place to work as well. I have many stories about that place.
Now was that more of a restaurant or a bar or?
It was, yeah. As you walked in the door, there was a piano, a grand piano right inside the door, and some lady would play there. She was a fascinating woman, very good entertainer. And she was known for growing grass at her location, wherever she lived out of the city. And then there was a long bar that I worked with other bartenders, and then a restaurant on the side and in the back. So it was a very busy place. It wasn't gay per se, but a lot of gay people came there. Someone I was seeing used to come in there a lot. And one of the bartenders and I also had an affair going on. And eventually the owners asked us to leave because they felt we were ignoring the customers and spending too much time with each other behind the bar.
Well, apparently that was kind of a fortuitous event, because after you left Oliver, you had the pleasure of connecting with Scott Forbes, who, I've heard a lot about this story. I've interviewed some other people who work there and are producing a movie right now called Studio One Forever.
Yes.
And that was a little bit of an unusual experience, because Scott Forbes, to my knowledge, had virtually no experience in the bar business. He was an optometrist who, I guess, had a dream to resurrect what was the old factory and turn it into a world-class disco that later became probably one of the most iconic discos in California. So
yes, it was.
And you knew Scott as a customer from your other experiences at restaurants?
Actually, no. What happened when I was working at Oliver, someone told me later that Scott had watched me working up on the strip at the Windjammer and also at Oliver's. And I wasn't even aware of that because I didn't know who Scott Forbes was. Nobody did really at that time. But one night he came in and he introduced himself when I was working at the bar in Oliver. And he said he was going to open this club. He just referred to it as a club. And he needed a bartender, and he liked the way I worked and asked if I would be his bartender, one of his bartenders. And he wanted to open up soon. He said, come and have a look at the place and let me know what you think. So I met him there one afternoon. And when I walked in, they were painting the walls and everything. They were getting it all freshly ready to open. And he gave me a tour of the whole location, the dance floor and all the different bars and the back lot. And then he said, what do you think? Would you like to work for me? And I said, yeah, I would, but I want the back lot. And he said, you got it. So I was the bartender at the back lot when we opened in 1974.
And how long were you there?
About 4 years. Now, there were 5 owners, actually. Scott was the one that was well known, and everybody thought he was the owner. And they didn't really talk about the other owners, but there were Ernie Carruthers, who happened to be a black man, very nice man, Leonard Grant, and Michael Solomon, who's still around. In fact, he's in our documentary on Studio One, and someone named John Adams. So it was odd that Ernie Carruthers was there when there was some discussion about the discrimination that Studio One was doing.
Yeah, I've heard bits and pieces about that and read about it in different stories, and I'm not really sure what the truth is behind that, because while there may not have been a large mix of different racial customers there, it may have been predominantly white. That does not necessarily mean that it was designed to be that way. I mean, I'm sure that quite a number of the places that you worked, including the Windjammer and Oliver, may have had a clientele that was skewed more white, not because they didn't let people of color in, but because it wasn't popular with them for whatever reason. The type of music they played, the type of food they served, people that worked there. So
yeah, that was pretty much the way it was back in those days. Unfortunately, it just happened that way. So that's how I didn't really know Scott until he came offer me the job. And Studio One was a huge, huge success. It was the largest gay disco on the West Coast. And it just happened that it was, again, mostly white boys would go there. And I wasn't aware of any discrimination against blacks or anyone, because I was in the back lot. I wasn't up for people made their entrance. They even tried to prevent women from coming in. They would say things like, oh, you have open-toed shoes. You can't come in because you might get stepped on. Or if they saw some young black men, they might say, we need extra identification. Or they would use something to sort of discourage them from coming in, rather than saying, no, you can't come in because. That, I'm sure, didn't happen.
But yet one of the owners was black.
Exactly. There was an instance where one thing Scott had a habit of, he liked young men. And he had many times come in with young men. And once he came back where I was at the back lot, and he told me, or he asked me if I would make a drink for this young boy with him. And I said, no, I'm not going to. He said, what do you mean? And I said, it's obvious he's a minor. I said, if you want him to have a drink, you come behind the bar and fix it for him. And Scott just said, oh, whatever. And he went back into the dance floor with him. But one night, the place was busted. Somebody got caught serving a minor. So I don't remember what time of night it was, but everybody had to leave. And I'm sure we probably closed for the night. But all of us bartenders and waiters, we had to line up on the street on Lapeer. The Windjammer was the Studio One was a huge place on Lapeer and Robertson. So we had to stand in line on the sidewalk in front of the place for quite a long time. And I remember Scott walking by all of us and talking to us. And he said, he'd sort of chuckle and say, don't worry, if you go to jail, I'll get you out. What are you talking about? So we were there for quite a while. I don't remember exactly what happened with the charges, but we were finally let go. We could go home, and we didn't open the bar until the next night.
Now that space itself that Studio One was in was iconic because of its size and the impact it had. A lot of people don't realize that Studio One actually predates the gigantic New York discos. It was there before Studio One and before Limelight. And I mean, it was there before Studio 54 and Limelight and all that. And it just had a huge impact on the gay nightlife scene in Los Angeles.
Correct.
And the building itself was a prefab building that started off as a factory for manufacturing cameras for the movie industry. Correct. And evolved into being a nightclub later and various other incarnations. I think it might have been a furniture showroom or something at one point. Mm-hmm. But when Scott Forbes came in and they created Studio One and the Backlot really put that place on the map. I mean, you had A-list entertainers showing up, performing, or patronizing, having drinks there, socializing, going to the disco and dancing. It was quite the experience, I'm sure.
Yes, it was. That helped put it on the map quite a bit. And Chita Rivera did a couple of two shows there. But the first one she did, Liza Minnelli bought out the whole room. So when Chita Rivera appeared there the first time, it was strictly celebrities. Every movie star you could think of in Hollywood was there. So that was kind of exciting. And as far as Studio 54 in New York, they started that in New York because they saw how successful Studio One was. They didn't open until 1977. We'd already been open for 3 years. And then I think they closed 3 or 4 years after that. So they weren't open that long back in New York.
They were kind of a flash in the pan.
Yeah.
And Studio One lasted, nearly 20 years.
Yes, exactly.
So it was a big difference. And even though many more people know about Studio 54, particularly ones that don't live in California.
Right, yeah.
But
at Studio One, we had many celebrities who would come in and make appearances there. And of course, that brought in more of their friends who were also in the business. So the Backlot helped the fame of Studio One, besides the disco, which was incredibly huge. So it was very popular and packed every night.
Now, as a young guy from Iowa, did this just blow your mind when suddenly there was your first gay bar experience is a little mind-blowing to begin with, but then you become part of what later is one of the most iconic discos in the country, and you're seeing celebrities flock by and coming up, getting drinks from you and dancing and carrying on. Was that an incredible experience for you?
In a way it was, but I was sort of used to it. I thought it was just one of those things that happened. There was very few times I was blown away or overwhelmed by someone, except in our business, our parent business. There was one in particular that we had as a customer, was Natalie Wood, that I was almost shaking when I talked to her. But Studio One, I saw many celebrities. I had many celebrities for customers. So I'd go to their homes, and it was a natural thing for me. I just figured that's the way it is.
Now, after all these years, I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago, there was talk about tearing down Studio One, and they were building a mega complex there, brand new construction. Obviously, the property value has gone through the roof, and I think now is part of the city of West Hollywood, whereas before it was kind of a no man's land industrial park. And then, fortuitously, they figured out that since it was a prefabricated building, they could disassemble it. And through the efforts of some of the people that you're involved with the Studio One Forever movie and some other preservationists and activists in the Los Angeles area, they have decided to take that structure, which now has been disassembled, and to reassemble it on the property. Is that something that you would have hoped for, or were you kind of over the Studio One? That's ancient history. Who cares what they do with the building?
I really never thought about that until I heard there were stories for years by some people on Facebook and elsewhere where they kept saying that they're going to destroy the building, tear it down, and it's a landmark. It needs to be protected and saved. And I sort of thought, well, yeah, I guess it's a landmark. But then when I heard them talk about destroying the building, I thought, why would they destroy it? There must be something else. So I went to a meeting in 2017 with a few people that are also in this documentary that will be hopefully released later this year about the building and what its future will be. And we also met with the city council in Los Angeles. But when I went that night, we met in what was the back lot. And I looked where my bar was, and the bar wasn't there anymore. At this time, it was sort of a place where women would go there in their scanties and dance around, or what, I don't even know what kind of club it was. But for the first time, the windows all around the place were open where you could see the sky. And I thought, wow, I've never seen it like this. It was always dark when I was there, working, the spotlights and things like that. But when I took a closer look, I could almost see, when as a kid, I used to have Lincoln logs. I would take things apart. And to me, it reminded me of Lincoln logs. You could see where basically it was put together and it could be pulled apart. So I had many arguments with people who were saying, oh, they're going to destroy it. And I said, no, they're not going to destroy it. They'll dismantle it and save it. So I have many pictures showing the building as they were taking it apart, and they labeled each wall or something with a number so that they knew that's where that one went. So I knew they were going to dismantle the building. And there was talk for a long time of maybe saving 70% of the building, then it got down to 60%. So I'm not sure how much of it they can and will save, but hopefully they will save some of it. And it will be part of this new creation that they're going to do on Robertson Lane. So it will show from Santa Monica Boulevard. You'll be able to see the old entrance going into Studio One will be up on the second floor. You can't go in there, but you can see what it looked like back in those days.
Yeah, I've heard that it's going to be relocated to another place on the lot on the same.
Well, yeah, it's going to be turned basically. So the entrance that used to be on Lapeer will now be on Robertson. So it'll be more obvious. And their pictures of their plans were to build a hotel and have the Studio One entrance up above that they could see that. And they'll be underground. They're planning on making an entertainment venue or something underground. So they have a lot of exciting plans that I hope will take place, but we don't know yet.
Now, did you feel anything kind of emotional about being part of this Studio One Forever movie project? Did that?
Yeah, it was exciting for me, and it was kind of sad, exciting sort of thing. I wanted to be a part of it since I was the original bartender in the Backlot, and so many of the bartenders and customers are no longer here because of the AIDS epidemic. So I was glad to be a part of. I'm glad to be a part of this documentary. We also did a concert there 2 years ago. In fact, 2 years ago yesterday was when we did our concert there. And I was lucky enough to open the show. Well, Bruce Valanche opened the show with his talk and comedy stuff, and we had a band. And then Madam, the puppet Madam, was the first one on stage. And after her talk, she yelled out for Gary, because Madam and I were very close when Waylon Flowers was still alive. After they did their show, they would come to the bar, and I would look at Madam instead of Waylon just for the heck of it. Well, she introduced me, and so I went up on stage after I squeezed through tons of people to get to the stage, and she wanted a drink. So as I'm walking, I reached over the bar and grabbed an empty glass to take a drink to Madam. And I opened the show with a solo. I think I sang a song called Yes. And later on in the show, I sang a duet with the actress Liz Torres, who you might know from Gilmore Girls and other things.
Yeah.
So it was exciting to be there and be a part of that, and see a lot of people who used to go there.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of stories about memories from Studio One. And yesterday I interviewed Lloyd Coleman and Gary Steinberg.
Wonderful.
And,
they're part of this documentary, yes.
Yeah, they're producers of the documentary, and they also had a connection to the Backlot.
They produced many shows there, yes.
So they had a lot of memories, and they said that there are a lot of people, the ones who are still alive, that they are still friends with after all those years.
Yes.
It was definitely a family. You made some pretty close contacts and some good friends while you were working there or as a patron there.
That's very true. Yes. It was great to see Lloyd Coleman and all of them again after all those years when we got together for this documentary. We're doing getting together for interviews and filming and things. So it was a wonderful trip to hear the stories from each other.
Yeah, and I am so excited to actually see the movie when it comes out. I think yesterday they said it'll probably be hitting the film festival circuit next year, the beginning of the year.
Good.
And then I guess it'll be in general release after that. But it's just such an important part of our history, all these bars that played a part in our development as a community and as individuals.
That's right.
people are documenting, the activists and the riots and all this stuff, the violence that went on, the arson at bars, things of that nature. And there are so few good stories out there reminding us about what these iconic clubs were like. There's movies about Studio 54 and a handful of other clubs, but we really need to be doing this for, clubs around the country that really had a huge impact on their local markets. And I am so glad that that you're a part of this. And
I am too. It's very true. We need to preserve things like that and show people how wonderful it was at that time and how it helped a lot of people come out, if you will, or be more relaxed being gay. They had places to go where they felt comfortable and not threatened.
Now, more recently, as far as the Los Angeles bar scene goes, you've performed at a recently closed bar that had over 50 years of history in Los Angeles. And I think you performed there as recently as what, 2019 or 2020?
2019. Yes, as a matter of fact, yeah, that's Oil Can Harry's. I sang there for about 5 years. We would go every Sunday night. A lady who's since passed away, Lori Donato, was the pianist there. And there was a group, they had a drummer and guitarist and blah, blah, blah. So we would go there on Sunday afternoons, and many of us would sing for open mic. We could sing 2 or 3 songs or something like that. And when we had our Back to the Backlot concert on November 9th, 2 years ago yesterday, Lori Donato, who was the pianist at Oil Can Harry's, I invited her to be a part of our concert. So she was scheduled to perform there that night. But she called me in the morning to tell me the way she said it, she was nervous about tomorrow, which was Sunday, where she'd have to play for Oil Can Harry's. And I thought, oh, that's sad. I'm sorry to hear that. But because she said she was nervous, I decided I knew that our event at Studio One that night was going to go late. But I decided, and I wasn't going to go to Oil Can Harry's the next day because I thought I'd be tired. But after hearing Lori Donato say that to me, I said, I have to go there to hear her again. And I went there and I sang. And it was the last time she performed there. Now, Oil Can Harry's was a big, big part of my life, too. When I lived in Burbank, I used to go there a lot just to dance and drink. And then many years later, I started there as one of the singers for the last 5 years. So, yes, it was very important also.
Now, Oil Can Harry's, I'm a little confused about this because I haven't been able to find any connection. And maybe having some experience with the bar, you might know the answer to this. But there was an Oil Can Harry's, the original one, in Studio City, the one we're talking about here in Los Angeles. And then there was briefly an Oil Can Harry's in San Francisco as well.
I'm not aware of that. I don't know.
And there is still, to this day, an Oil Can Harry's in Austin, Texas.
Oh, wow.
And well, I've asked several people, and no one has been able to answer this, so I'm guessing you will join that club, whether they were related or somebody just said, hey, that's a cool name. I'm going to call my bar that in a different city.
I think that's really what happened, because if it's a popular name, they said, yeah, we can call it that too. As a matter of fact, when I left Oliver's, it was still called Oliver's when I went to work at Studio One. But for some reason, the owner decided to change the name to After Dark. Well, coincidentally, right down the street, a few blocks away and around the corner, was another place also called After Dark, and they were not connected in any way. They just had the same name.
Yeah, I've seen that happen before.
It's happened a lot.
Sometimes in the same city, and sometimes hundreds or thousands of miles apart.
Yes, that's right.
It's like some gay guy from Los Angeles happened to be in, Minnesota and saw a cool name for a bar, and he'd go back to Los Angeles and said, that's what I'm going to call my bar.
Sure. I think Studio 54, they might have called it Studio One back in New York, but it was on 54th Street. Right. So they decided to call it Studio 54.
If I'm not mistaken, it was 54 West 54th Street, I think.
Something like that. Yes.
But yeah, it was a flash in the pan. And most people, if you ask them about an iconic disco, that's the one they're going to mention, is
Right.
either that or Limelight. And
Yeah.
and yet Studio One outlasted them by decades. I mean, it was
That's true.
an
True.
incredible bar and a big part of our gay bar history.
Yes.
So after you had all these experiences with these different restaurants and bars, you then found yourself in a situation where real life kind of interfered with the concept of bartending. And you and your partner had a business. What was that business, and was that the reason that you left the bar industry?
It was a parrot business. We were exclusively parrots. We were called Pyramid Birds / Parrot Dice. My late partner, he passed away 30 years ago. We opened our first location on Sunset Strip, right next to the Chateau Marmont Hotel. And we were there for a year, but the lady who owned the property sold it to the Chateau. The Chateau, if you remember, is where John Belushi was found. Did I mention that before? I
You
don't
did
know.
not. I was aware
Okay.
of it from when I visited there.
Yeah.
But you
So
didn't.
we had to move from that location on Sunset, and somehow we found this location down on Robertson Boulevard, which was right down the street from Studio One. So this was our second location, and I think our second or third year in business. And I was still tending bar at the Backlot, but I finally decided I couldn't work till 2 or 3 in the morning and then get home and get as much sleep as I could and work our business. So finally, I had to just tell Scott and the others, I can't do this anymore. So I left bartending to concentrate on our parrot business. And we had the largest collection of parrot species anywhere. And it was pretty much documented that we had more parrot species than any zoo in the world. So we were quite famous for that and our celebrity customers.
That is pretty impressive. And I've seen pictures. We'll put a couple up here so people can see how interesting the store looked with the murals on the walls and
Yes.
and some of the birds. I have never owned a parrot myself, but
Okay.
I have one boyfriend and one roommate at separate times who had parrots, and they are incredible animals.
They are.
Did you own several of your own, or were the ones in the pet store close enough?
Well, the ones in the pet store were close enough. I did have one, a scarlet macaw cricket, that was basically my bird, and my partner, he had a couple that were his birds too. I eventually sold cricket, but in the beginning, we basically almost lived in the store with the birds. So we were around them like 24 hours a day. In fact, in one location on La Brea, we literally had to live in the store. We couldn't afford an apartment. It was a huge place. So we had someone build a partition for us to put our bed. So for 9 months, we were in that location before I found another place for us. But as far as you mentioned the paintings in the store, Scott Forbes had a young lover who was from Australia. His name was Vivian Vance. He did have a feminine name, but it was Vivian. I mean, not Vivian Vance, excuse me, Vivian Walker.
I was going to say Vivian Vance was Lucille Ball's co-star.
Yeah. No, Vivian Walker. But he had this huge painting that I liked so much because it looked like a pyramid on the ground and a pyramid in the sky, and there was this thing flying around that would lower the pyramid. That was the idea, he told us, would lower the pyramids into place. Well, our store was called Pyramid Birds, and I've been to Egypt too. So Vivian liked that because it was sort of Egyptian theme, and we said, how about you come and paint our store for us? So he did just that, and he did some incredible painting. Walking into the location, we were in a building with 2 other businesses. And on Robertson, when you're out front, you could see a dog groomer on one side and a tailor on the other side. And our store was way in the back. So they allowed us to put our sign in the front of the building up above, which we did, Pyramid Birds, Parrot Dice. And Vivian, to help, he painted on both walls as you walked into the back, it looked like a river. And he said, that's the Nile. And as you walk into our store, there's a huge, from floor to ceiling painting of King Tut that was just incredible. And throughout the store, he had different hieroglyphics and different things. And off to the side, before you went at our main door, we lived upstairs. So there was a little stairway going up. He painted another figure, Egyptian figure, with his hands sort of pointing that way. So some of our customers, like Barbara Streisand and others, we would let them come up to where we lived to see. We had a few birds up there. And eventually, we had so many birds up there that were customers' birds. We were boarding for celebrities or selling them. We finally had to find a bigger place than that. But then Vivian Walker did a lot of painting for us in that location.
Have you managed to keep any of his paintings?
No. In
Just
fact, when we left that building, they painted everything over. All I had was photographs of it.
That's so sad.
Yeah.
Now, you were saying he was Australian. I've heard from a couple other people I've spoken
Aborigine.
to, yeah, that he was Aboriginal Australian. He wasn't
Yes.
a European Australian.
No, that's right.
And so that again, begs the question: how could Studio One have really been that discriminatory if one of the owners is black and another one is dating an Aboriginal Australian? That's just
Exactly. I think it was one of those things that one of those stories would begin to be told and they would magnify it. It wasn't really as bad as they said it was, but apparently some of that did take place. I'm just not personally aware of it because I wasn't there to physically see or hear it happen.
Right. And, I remember I had my first gay bar experience in the late 70s. And
Wow.
so
You're so young.
and everybody else that's listening is going, oh my God, there were gay bars in the 70s.
Really?
But I remember a number of the bars that I went to in retrospect, looking back at it, that, a lot of them were predominantly white or, predominantly male or predominantly whatever. But
Yes.
I don't remember any of them being discriminatory at the door. I just remember that happened to be the way it was. And that, they were in the neighborhood that you happened to live or socialize in.
Mm-hmm.
There were other factors that involved whether or not people went there beyond the fact that they were keeping you out because of a race or a gender issue.
Sure.
And of course, back then we did have a lot more bars that were exclusively men.
Yeah.
And all along, I think throughout our history, and you can speak to this from the Los Angeles perspective, but as far as I can tell from what I've looked at researching all these bars, and I've documented over 1,500 across the country that are no longer
Wow.
in business now, but the lesbian bars were always few and far between.
True.
If there were 25 male-oriented bars in Los Angeles, there might have been 2 or maybe 3
Mm-hmm.
women-oriented bars, because the women didn't patronize them as much or didn't require that aspect of their nightlife. They were more homebodies or whatever the case was. It never seemed that there were as many women's bars as there were men's.
That's true. Back in those days, there were more gay men bars, a few lesbian bars, because I guess they wanted it to be exclusively boys or men, which brings up the point of there were a couple bars that were where more senior gays could go to, because some of the bars you almost knew they preferred young hotties instead of old men, So there were a couple of places where a lot of the seniors would go and they could relax and they might bring their young friends with them. But that was almost discriminatory in its own way too.
Yeah. And of course I've heard about, numerous bars and restaurants, including Numbers, which were known for having a mix of older and younger, but it was assumed in those bars, if you were over the age of 30, that you were a buyer. And if you were under the age of 30, you were a seller.
That's right.
A transactional relationship. It wasn't a matter of socializing together. It was a matter of, there was a financial exchange involved in those situations.
Yeah, that's sort of the popular belief that what happened back then, I guess. Yeah.
So in addition to your bird business, which I assume is closed now.
Yes, I closed that about 30 years ago because I just couldn't do it without my partner anymore.
So what have you been doing since then?
I'm sorry?
What have you been doing since then?
Even when I had the bar, I'm sorry, the business, being a singer, one of my voice teachers was a choir director at a church in Pasadena, which at the time was very spiritual and metaphysical and mystical. I wasn't a churchgoer at all. I grew up a Methodist in Iowa. I had to. And in the Navy, I almost became a Catholic because many of my friends were Catholics, and I went to a Catholic building there on the base. And at that time, it was all in Latin, so I didn't know what they were saying, but I thought, this is pretty cool. I almost became a Catholic, but thank God I left that behind. I had a voice teacher who was Christian Scientist. She showed me a little bit about that, and I said, okay. Then my last voice teacher, Harold Brown, was also an actor and a singer who did things like Man of La Mancha. He toured the country with Jose Ferrer, so he was a wonderful singer. He invited me to this church to sing a solo one Easter, and I said, well, I don't do church, but it's a gig. I'm getting paid. I'll go. Well, when I went there, there was a lady minister there, and it just blew me away. I said, now this makes sense. And it basically that everything is within us. There's no heaven, there's nothing up there like that. So I decided to join. So I sang in that choir for probably 25 years or more. But I also became the office manager, which I worked in for 25 years. And I was recently released from there almost 3 years ago because they were sort of going more into Bible stuff, and I didn't like that. I didn't want any part of it. So they said, well, it's time for you to leave. Coincidentally, my first Sunday there was Easter, and my last Sunday there was Easter. 37 years.
Wow.
So I'm retired now.
Do you ever do singing gigs anymore? Now that Oil King Harris is closed, you don't have that one to go back to, but.
Right. I sing on Zoom meetings 2 and 3 times a week, and I still go to clubs. In fact, I'm going tomorrow to Palm Springs to sing in one. It's an open mic, a place called Frankie's in Cathedral City. And I've also sung at a place called Oscars in Palm Springs. I've sung there 3 times so far. So once these clubs are opening up again, I'm going to get back into clubs singing more live things and hopefully do my own show soon at some clubs here in town, in Hollywood and Palm Springs.
Well, who knew when you walked into that gay bar in San Diego in the mid-'60s that the gay bar scene would play such a big role in your life for so many years? It's an amazing story.
That's true. I knew as a kid, I was the last of 6 kids. I had 3 older brothers and 2 older sisters. As a young man, I knew I was different somehow. I was very much by myself. I had friends, school friends, of course, but I was by myself. I would observe a lot of guys. They might have been in their 20s, but they were a lot older than me because I was so young. But I would look at them and I wondered, why do I like them? What is all this about? I didn't know what gay meant at that time. But I had a few experiences there, even in high school, that sort of showed me what it was all about. But I didn't admit that I was a gay man until probably when I was in the Navy. And then finally decided to just come out and be natural.
Well, I'm glad you took the time to tell us about, some of the bars that you remember from the past. And
thank you.
And I really appreciate the fact that you're a part of this Studio One Forever movie that we should all be looking forward to, and maybe kind of re-energize the whole concept of, remembering and embracing some of our gay history.
I hope so. Thank you very much, Art.
That concludes another episode of the Gay Barchive Show. For more information about this episode, or to find more episodes, visit gaybarchives.com.